June 23, 1942. 3,000 feet above the Taman Peninsula, Soviet-occupied territory. Lieutenant Klaus Weber pressed his face against the cold glass of the observation post, scanning the moonless sky for the source of the sound that had woken him. A faint rustling like wind through fabric, then silence, then again closer this time. The sound that German soldiers along the Eastern Front had begun to fear more than artillery, more than tanks, more than Stalin's legendary snipers, the sound of death approaching on silent wings. Nachthexen, whispered his sergeant, making the sign of the cross. Night witches. Weber grabbed his binoculars, but there was nothing to see. Just darkness. The sound grew louder, a rushing, whooshing noise like an enormous broom sweeping through the air. Then he saw it. A shadow darker than the night itself, a biplane no larger than a crop duster, gliding silently toward their position, with its engine completely shut. Off the bombs fell before Weber could shout a warning. What the young German officer didn't know, what terrified the Wehrmacht from Stalingrad to Berlin, was that the pilot dropping those bombs was a 19-year-old Soviet woman flying a wooden aircraft, held together with fabric and wire, a plane so primitive that it had been obsolete before the war even started, a machine that shouldn't have been able to fight at all. Her name was Nadezhda Popova. She would fly 852 combat missions before the war ended. She would be shot down multiple times, crash land in enemy territory, survive more close calls than any reasonable person should endure. And she would become one of the most decorated women in Soviet military history. But in June 1942, she was just a girl who had volunteered for a suicide mission, flying a death trap into the teeth of the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. This is the story of how a regiment of women flying wooden biplanes became the most feared night raiders on the Eastern Front, how German soldiers offered rewards for shooting them down, how they flew more missions than any male regiment, and how, despite being dismissed, mocked, and underestimated by both sides, they proved that courage has no gender, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the biggest gun, but the person willing to fly straight into hell, armed with nothing but determination and a few bombs. October 8, 1941, Moscow, the office of Marina Raskova, Marina Mikhailovna. Raskova was already a Soviet legend when the war began. At 29, she had set multiple aviation records, navigated the first non-stop flight across Siberia, and become the first woman in the Soviet Air Force to achieve the rank of major. Soviet propaganda called her the Soviet Amelia Earhart. Stalin himself knew her name. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Raskova did what thousands of Soviet women were doing. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, all saying the same thing: let us fight. Give us planes. We can serve. The Soviet High Command's response was predictable. Women could serve as nurses, radio operators, mechanics. Combat, impossible. The physical demands were too great. The psychological toll too severe. War was men's work, but the letters kept coming. Thousands of them now, from women across the Soviet Union. Pilots, engineers, students, factory workers, all begging for the chance to fight. Raskova took the letters directly to Stalin. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. Nobody knows exactly what was said, but on October 8, 1941, Joseph Stalin signed Order 099, authorizing the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments: the 586th Fighter Regiment, the 587th Bomber Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Raskova would command the 587th herself, but it was the 588th, the Night Bombers, that would become legendary. The reason was simple. The 588th would fly the Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane designed in 1928 as a training aircraft and crop duster. It was made of plywood and fabric. It had a maximum speed of 94 miles per hour. It had no radio, no guns, no parachutes, no armor, and barely any instruments. Flying it in combat was considered suicide, which is exactly why they gave it to the women. December 1941. Engels Air Base, 450 miles southeast of Moscow. When the first recruits arrived at Engels, they found a frozen airfield, half-constructed barracks, and rows of Po-2 biplanes that looked like museum pieces. Nadezhda Popova, 19 years old, stared at her assigned aircraft in disbelief. She had trained on modern planes. This looked like something her grandfather would have flown. The Po-2 was a relic. 2 open cockpits, one behind the other. Wings made of plywood covered in canvas. A single 100-horsepower engine that produced less power than a modern motorcycle. Maximum bomb load 772 pounds, carried in makeshift racks under the wings. Maximum altitude, 10,000 feet on a good day. The male engineers at Engels made no secret of their opinions. "You're going to die in these things," one mechanic told Popova. "First mission, maybe second if you're lucky. The Germans will shoot you down like clay pigeons." He wasn't entirely wrong. The Po-2 had no defensive armament except what the navigator could carry, usually a rifle or pistol. The fabric skin provided zero protection against bullets. A single tracer round could set the entire aircraft on fire in seconds. The wooden frame would disintegrate under machine gun fire. But the Po-2 had advantages that nobody at Engels understood yet. Advantages that would transform this obsolete crop duster into the most effective harassment weapon on the Eastern Front. First, it was slow. So slow that German fighters couldn't engage it effectively. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 had a stall, speed of 75 mph. The Po-2 cruised at 80 mph. German pilots trying to shoot down the lumbering biplanes found themselves stalling and spinning if they slowed down, enough to match speeds. Second, it was small. With a wingspan of just 37 feet and painted black for night operations, the Po-2 was nearly invisible in darkness. German searchlights struggled to track it. Flak gunners had to guess its position. Third, it could glide. The revolutionary tactic that would give the 588th its legendary status was discovered by accident during training. If the pilot cut the engine at altitude and glided toward the target, the Po-2 made almost no sound. Just the whisper of wind through wing struts and fabric. It was Yevdokia Bershanskaya, appointed commander of the 588th Regiment, who recognized the tactical potential. "We don't need to be fast," she told her assembled pilots in January 1942. "We don't need to be heavily armed. We need to be invisible, unexpected, and everywhere at once. We will fly at night. We will fly low. We will shut off our engines and glide to our targets. And before the Germans know we're there, we'll be gone." The male officers laughed. The women didn't. They understood exactly what Bershanskaya was proposing. They were going to become ghosts. May 27, 1942. The Northern Caucasus Front. The 588th. Night Bomber Regiment flew its first combat mission on a moonless night in late May 1942. 13 Po-2 biplanes, each carrying 2 110-pound bombs, lifted off from a temporary airfield and headed toward German positions near Voroshilovsk. The plan was simple. Fly to the target area at 3,000 feet, cut the engine, glide silently to bomb release altitude, drop the bombs, restart the engine, escape in the darkness. Simple, suicidal, revolutionary. Nadezhda Popova was in the third aircraft. She described the experience years later in interviews that still capture the absolute terror of that first mission. "I was more afraid before takeoff than I ever was in combat," she recalled. "My navigator, Katya, kept checking her maps with a tiny flashlight. We couldn't show any lights. The Germans were everywhere below us. If they saw us, we were dead." At 3,000 feet, Popova reached forward and shut off the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming. Just wind, the creak of wing struts, her own breathing. Below, German positions twinkled with campfires and vehicle lights. They had no idea death was gliding toward them from above. At 800 feet, Popova pulled the bomb release. 2 explosions bloomed in the darkness. Then chaos. Searchlights stabbed upward. Tracer fire arced into the sky. German flak batteries opened up, firing blindly at sounds they couldn't see. Popova dove, falling away from the target area. At 500 feet, she hit the starter. The engine coughed, sputtered, and caught. The Po-2 shuddered back to life. She banked hard left and ran for the darkness, German tracers following her like angry fireflies. All 13 aircraft returned safely. The Germans reported a major air raid, estimating at least 100 aircraft involved. There had been 13. The tactic worked better than anyone had dared hope. The Germans couldn't track the silent gliders. Their searchlights swept empty sky while the Po-2s slipped through the darkness. Their fighters were useless. By the time they scrambled, the night bombers were gone. Their flak was firing at ghosts, But the 588th quickly learned that their greatest danger wasn't German defenses. It was the aircraft itself. June 1942. The realities of Po-2 operations. The Po-2 killed its crews in ways that had nothing to do with enemy fire. The fabric covering the wings and fuselage was highly flammable. A single tracer round could set the entire aircraft ablaze in seconds. Fire extinguishers? The Po-2 didn't have them. Parachutes? Too heavy, they needed the weight for bombs. The pilot's standing orders were clear. If your aircraft catches fire, dive it into the ground as fast as possible. Maybe you'll put out the flames. Probably you'll die. But at least you'll die fast. The wooden frame disintegrated under stress. Hard maneuvers could tear wings off. Pulling out too aggressively from a dive could snap the fuselage like kindling. Pilots learned to treat their aircraft like fragile birds, coaxing them through the air rather than commanding them. The open cockpits exposed pilots and navigators to temperatures that regularly dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite was common. Hypothermia was a constant threat. The women learned to stuff newspapers inside their leather jackets for insulation. They wrapped their faces in scarves until only their eyes showed. Their fingers froze to metal controls. Their breath formed ice crystals on their goggles, and they flew multiple missions, every single night. The standard operating procedure for the 588th was brutal. Each crew would fly between 8 and 15 missions per night. Take off, fly to target, drop bombs, return, land, reload, refuel, take off again, 8 to 15 times. Every night. Without rest, the ground crews had it worse. They had to refuel aircraft by hand, using buckets and funnels. They loaded bombs in darkness, working by feel because lights would attract German bombers. They repaired battle damage with whatever materials they could scavenge. Canvas torn from tents, wood from destroyed buildings, wire from broken fences. Senior Sergeant Inna Pasportnikova, air mechanic with the 588th, described the routine. We would work for 18-20 hours straight. The aircraft would land, engines still running while we ran out to refuel them. The pilots wouldn't even shut down completely, just long enough for us to pour in fuel and hang new bombs. Then they'd take off again. We'd see the same crews 6, 8, 10 times a night. By morning, everyone was like zombies. But the planes kept flying. The accident rate was horrific. In the first 3 months of operations, the 588th lost more aircraft to operational accidents than enemy action. Po-2s crashed on takeoff. They stalled at low altitude. They flew into terrain in darkness. They collided with each other over target areas. The Germans weren't killing them fast enough, so the aircraft was doing it for them. But something remarkable was happening. The women were adapting, learning, becoming incredibly skilled at coaxing performance from these obsolete machines that engineers said couldn't fight. They discovered that the Po-2 could turn inside any German fighter. Its slow speed and tight turning radius meant a Messerschmitt trying to engage would overshoot and lose sight of its target. They learned to fly so low, sometimes just 50 feet above ground, that German radar couldn't track them and flak couldn't depress low enough to shoot at them. Most importantly, they perfected the silent glide attack, July 1942. The German perspective. Gefreiter Hans Speidel, 24th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary on July 15, 1942, "The witches came again last night. 3 times. We heard them but never saw them. Just that rustling sound like fabric tearing, getting louder and louder. Then bombs, then silence, then the sound again from a different direction. Nobody sleeps anymore. We just lie in our dugouts and wait for the sound." The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches. The nickname came from the sound the Po-2s made during their attack glides. With engines off, the wind rushing through the wooden wing struts and fabric skin created an eerie whistling, rustling sound that soldiers compared to witches' broomsticks sweeping through the air. Psychological warfare experts would later recognize this as one of the most effective terror weapons of the war. The sound announced death was coming, but gave no indication of when or where it would strike. Soldiers would hear the rustling getting louder, closer, knowing bombs were about to fall, but unable to see the aircraft or predict its position. German units facing the 588th reported severe morale problems. Sleep deprivation was universal. Soldiers developed something psychiatrists would later call acoustic shock, jumping at any rustling sound, even wind through trees or camp equipment. The German command initially dismissed the night bomber attacks as nuisance raids. The Po-2's small bomb load, just 772 pounds per aircraft, couldn't destroy major targets. But they missed the point. The 588th wasn't trying to destroy targets. They were trying to destroy sleep, morale, and sanity. And it was working. A single Po-2 carrying two 110-pound bombs couldn't destroy a tank. But 15 Po-2s making multiple runs could keep an entire division awake all night, disrupt supply convoys, force constant movement, and create a pervasive atmosphere of terror. By August 1942, German forces were requesting dedicated night fighter squadrons specifically to counter the 588th. The Luftwaffe's response reveals how seriously they took the threat. They offered the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military honor, to any pilot who shot down a night witch. The standard practice was to award the Iron Cross for shooting down 10 enemy aircraft. For the night witches, the requirement was just one. That's how dangerous the Germans considered these women in their wooden biplanes. August 1942, January 1943. The education of an ace. Nadezhda Popova flew her 100th combat mission in September 1942. She was 20 years old by then. She had been shot down twice. The first time her aircraft caught fire over German lines. She dove it into the ground at maximum speed, jumped clear as it exploded, and walked 18 miles back to Soviet lines through German-occupied territory. The second time, a Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter caught her formation during a full moon night. The German pilot shot down 3 Po-2s in less than 2 minutes. Popova's aircraft took multiple cannon hits that shredded her left wing and killed her engine. She glided 10 miles to an emergency landing in a field, rebuilt the wing using fabric cut from a parachute, and flew the damaged aircraft home the next night. She described combat in terms that captured both the terror and the routine of night bombing. Every mission, you knew you might not come back. The aircraft was so fragile. One bullet in the right place and you were burning. But after a while it became normal, just work. You'd take off, fly to the target, shut off the engine, glide down, drop your bombs, restart the engine, fly home. Then do it again and again. 8 times, 10 times, 15 times in one night. By morning, you were so tired you could barely climb out of the cockpit. But you'd sleep a few hours and then do it all over again the next night. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots developed superstitions, lucky charms, pre-flight rituals. Some refused to wash their flight suits, believing the dirt and grime was protective. Others carried photographs, letters, religious icons. One pilot flew every mission with a small stuffed bear given to her by her son. The casualties mounted steadily. By January 1943, the 588th had lost 23 crews, 46 women killed. Every loss hit the regiment hard. These weren't just fellow soldiers. They were friends, roommates, sometimes sisters. But something else was happening. The survivors were becoming extraordinarily skilled. They could navigate by stars alone, estimate wind drift by feel, judge altitude by sound and air pressure. They knew their aircraft so intimately that they could diagnose engine problems by the slightest change in vibration. They could glide onto targets with accuracy that astonished forward observers. German commanders began noting in their reports that night attacks were becoming more accurate, more coordinated, more devastating. What they didn't realize was that they were no longer facing enthusiastic amateurs. They were facing professionals who had learned their deadly trade through hundreds of missions. The night witches were no longer an experiment. They were a weapon. February 2nd, 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad. While the world watched the epic struggle at Stalingrad, the 588th Regiment flew its most intensive operations of the war. For 96 consecutive nights, from November 1942 through February 1943, the Night Witches flew constant harassment missions against German forces besieging the city. The missions were brutal. German forces surrounded Stalingrad in a massive arc, meaning the Po-2s had to fly deep into enemy-controlled territory. Winter weather made flying conditions lethal: blizzards, ice, temperatures that regularly hit 40 degrees. On the night of February 2nd, as German forces at Stalingrad finally surrendered, the 588th flew 324 sorties. That's 18 aircraft, each making 18 missions, 18 times taking off, flying to target, dropping bombs, returning, in one night. In winter, over a battlefield where every German soldier was looking up, desperate to shoot down anything flying Soviet colors, Yevdokia Nikulina flew 17 missions that night. She described it as automatic, like breathing. Take off, fly, drop, return, land, refuel, take off again. I don't remember most of it. Just sitting in the cockpit, freezing, exhausted, waiting for my navigator to tap my shoulder and point toward the next target. The maintenance crews performed miracles. Some aircraft were turned around in less than 8 minutes. Ground crews would sprint to meet landing aircraft, carrying fuel and bombs. They'd refuel while pilots reported on the previous mission, load bombs while navigators updated maps, push the aircraft back to the runway while crews were still buckling in. One mechanic, Sofia Ozerkova, later recalled, "We were like machines ourselves. We didn't think, we just worked. Fuel, bombs, check the engine, patch the bullet holes, push it back to the line, next aircraft, and again and again. By morning, my hands were bleeding. I couldn't feel my feet, but we got them back in the air." The cost was horrific. The 588th lost 5 crews that night, 10 women killed. 1 aircraft exploded on takeoff when a bomb detonated prematurely. 2 were shot down over target areas. 1 crashed on landing approach, the pilot too exhausted to judge altitude correctly. 1 simply disappeared, likely flying into terrain in darkness and weather. But the survivors kept flying. Because that's what they did. Because Stalingrad was hanging in the balance. Because their country needed them. Because if they didn't fly, German soldiers would sleep, and rested soldiers fight better. The Night Witches didn't just drop bombs on Stalingrad. They dropped exhaustion, terror, and madness. Spring 1943. The Luftwaffe responds. By mid-1943, the German High Command realized they had a serious problem. The Night Witches weren't just a propaganda nuisance anymore. They were genuinely disrupting operations across the entire Eastern Front. The solution was to deploy dedicated night fighter squadrons equipped with Bf-110 heavy fighters fitted with early radar systems and searchlights. These specialized aircraft could detect the Po-2s at night and engage them effectively. The results were devastating. On the night of July 31, 1943, German night fighters found a formation of Po-2s heading toward German positions near Krasnodar. The formation leader was Yevgenia Zhigulenko, one of the regiment's most experienced pilots with over 200 missions. Zhigulenko never saw the fighter that killed her. A burst of 20mm cannon fire tore her aircraft apart. She and her navigator, Klavdia Fomicheva, were killed instantly. The wreckage burned on German-held ground. The loss sent shockwaves through the regiment. Zhigulenko was considered invincible. If she could be killed, anyone could be killed. The next night, German fighters shot down 4 more Po-2s, then 3 more. The 588th's loss rate, which had been sustainable, suddenly spiked to catastrophic levels. The women adapted. They began flying even lower, sometimes at 50 feet above ground, well below where radar could track them. They flew in worse weather, using clouds and storms to hide. They scattered more, making it harder for fighters to find multiple targets, and they developed new tactics specifically to counter night fighters. If a Po-2 pilot spotted a fighter approaching, standard procedure was to immediately cut the engine. And sideslip, a maneuver where the aircraft falls sideways through the air while maintaining directional control. In the darkness, a Po-2 could drop 1,000 feet in seconds, vanishing from the fighter pilot's sight picture. By the time the German pilot searched lower airspace, the Po-2 was gone, hiding in ground clutter or behind terrain. Irina Sebrova, who would end the war with 1,008 missions, the most of any pilot in the regiment, described fighting night fighters. They were faster, more powerful, better armed. But we were smaller, slower, more maneuverable. It was like a hawk hunting a bat. The hawk is deadly, but the bat can twist and turn and hide in ways the hawk can't follow. We learned to use that. Cut the engine, drop like a stone, twist sideways, hide against the ground. Let the fighter waste fuel searching. Then when he gave up and left, we'd climb back up and continue our mission. The Night Witches were fighting the most technologically advanced air force in the world, using tactics that would have been familiar to World War I pilots. And they were winning. 1943-1944, the human cost. By late 1943, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had become one of the most decorated units in the Soviet Air Force. But the statistics told a darker story. Of the original 400 women who began training at Engels in 1941, 32 were dead. That's an 8% fatality rate. For comparison, the average bomber crew in the US 8th Air Force faced a 10% chance of death. The Night Witches' survival rate was better than expected, but those numbers didn't capture the reality, because unlike bomber crews who flew 25 missions and then rotated home, the Night Witches flew until the war ended, or they died. Some pilots flew over 800 missions, some over 900. Nadezhda Popova would fly 852 missions before war's end. The mathematical probability of surviving that many combat missions in an unarmored wooden aircraft was essentially zero, yet they did it. The psychological cost was immense. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't diagnosed or treated in the 1940s. Soldiers were just expected to cope. Many didn't. Pilots developed what they called night terrors, waking up screaming, convinced they were trapped in a burning aircraft. Some became paranoid, unable to trust that their aircraft was properly maintained. Others became reckless, taking insane risks because they no longer cared if they died. The Soviet command's solution was alcohol. Vodka was issued before and after missions. It helped with the cold, helped with the fear, helped with the memories. It also created alcoholism problems that would plague survivors for the rest of their lives. But they kept flying. Because what else could they do? The war wasn't over. The Germans were still there, and the Night Witches had a job to do. The bond between crews was extraordinary. Pilot and navigator flew together for months or years, learning to communicate without words in the darkness. They knew each other's rhythms, fears, habits. When one died, it wasn't just losing a crewmate. It was losing a part of yourself. Nadezhda Popova lost 3 navigators during the war. Each time she thought about requesting a ground assignment. Each time she went back up, because her dead friends deserved to be avenged, because quitting would mean their deaths were for nothing. In her later years, Popova said, "I never got used to the deaths. Every loss hurt. But we couldn't afford to grieve. Not during the war. You just had to lock it away and keep flying." Many of us didn't deal with those emotions until decades later. The war ended, but the trauma never did. Summer 1944, the offensive that broke Germany. By June 1944, the Soviet Union was ready for its massive offensive to drive German forces from Soviet territory. Operation Bagration would destroy Army Group Center, killing or capturing 400,000 German soldiers in one of history's most devastating military defeats. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment played a crucial role. For 60 consecutive nights, the Night Witches flew constant missions against German supply lines, ammunition dumps, headquarters, and troop concentrations. They disrupted German attempts to move reinforcements. They prevented sleep. They created chaos. The missions were different now. The women were veterans, and their tactics had evolved into something far more sophisticated than the experimental glide attacks of 1942. They flew coordinated attacks with multiple aircraft, hitting targets from different directions simultaneously. They used flares dropped by lead aircraft to illuminate targets for following bombers. They had radio coordination. The Po-2s had finally been equipped with basic radios in late 1943. They worked with partisan groups who would mark targets with fires or lights. Most importantly, they had replaced many of their Po-2s with more capable aircraft. While the regiment maintained the Po-2 as its primary platform because it worked so well, some crews now flew P-2 light bombers that could carry heavier loads. But many pilots, including Popova, refused to switch. They had survived in Po-2s. They understood Po-2s. They trusted Po-2s. The old crop dusters had brought them through hundreds of missions. Why change now? During Bagration, German commanders reported that night raids had become so intense that entire units were combat ineffective from exhaustion. Supply convoys refused to move at night. Headquarters had to relocate constantly. Ammunition dumps burned. Communication lines were cut. A German colonel captured during the offensive told his interrogators, "We planned for Soviet artillery, Soviet tanks, Soviet infantry. We did not plan for those damn biplanes. They were everywhere, every night, all night. You couldn't fight them, couldn't see them, couldn't escape them." Just that sound. That terrible rustling sound. And then explosions. My men were hallucinating from lack of sleep. Some refused to leave their bunkers even during daytime. The witches had broken them. The night witches weren't just supporting Operation Bagration, they were helping to win it. 45. Flying into Germany. As Soviet forces pushed into Eastern Europe and finally Germany itself, the 588th Regiment went with them. By early 1945, they were flying missions over German soil, dropping bombs on the nation that had invaded their homeland nearly 4 years earlier. The missions were bittersweet. Victory was clearly coming, but the end of the war meant confronting everything they had suppressed. The trauma, the losses, the horrors they'd witnessed. Many pilots later said the last months of the war were psychologically harder than the first. On the night of May 4, 1945, 4 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, Senior Lieutenant Rufina Gasheva flew what would be the 588th's final combat mission of the war. She and her navigator attacked German positions near Swinemünde on the Baltic coast. It was mission number 863 for Gasheva. She had survived the entire war without being shot down, a statistical miracle that she attributed to luck, skill, and the fact that her aircraft, an original PO-2 from 1941, was too stubborn to die. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had flown 23,672 combat sorties. They had dropped 3,000 tons of bombs. They had been credited with destroying or damaging 17 river crossings, 9 railways, 2 railway stations, 26 warehouses, 12 fuel depots, 176 armored cars, 86 firing positions, and hundreds of vehicles in German camps. 32 crews had been killed, 64 women. 23 women of the 588th were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. Every surviving pilot and navigator received multiple medals. The regiment itself received the Guards designation, becoming the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. But perhaps the most telling statistic was this: of the women who flew for the Night Witches, not one was ever captured alive by German forces. They knew what would happen if they were captured. So they chose to die in their aircraft, rather than fall into enemy hands. That's the kind of courage the 588th represented. May 1945. Peace, and the challenge of survival. When Nadezhda Popova climbed out of her PO-2 for the last time on May 15, 1945, she was 23 years old. She had flown 852 combat missions. She had been shot down multiple times, wounded twice, decorated 5 times. She was one of the most experienced combat pilots in the world. The Soviet Union didn't know what to do with her or any of them. The Night Witches returned home to discover that the country they'd fought for had very traditional ideas about women's roles. They were heroes, yes, but they were also expected to return to normal lives, get married, have children, forget about flying. Many struggled. After flying multiple combat missions every night for 4 years, civilian life felt pointless, boring, empty. Several pilots applied to continue flying for the Soviet Air Force. The military said no. Combat aviation was for men now. The women had served their purpose. Popova was one of the lucky ones. She married Semyon Kharlamov, a fellow PO-2 pilot. They both became flying instructors. She could still fly, even if it wasn't combat. But many of her fellow Night Witches never flew again. The Soviet Union was initially proud of its female combat pilots. Then, as Cold War tensions developed and Stalin's paranoia increased, official attitudes changed. Having large numbers of independent, combat-experienced women who had seen the world outside Soviet borders made the government nervous. The Night Witches were quietly downplayed in official histories. Their exploits were mentioned, but not emphasized. Some were subjected to security investigations. The message was clear: you served well. Now be quiet and be normal. For decades, the Night Witches' story was largely forgotten outside the Soviet Union. In the West, they were completely unknown. When mentioned at all, they were dismissed as propaganda, the product of Soviet exaggeration. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that historians began seriously studying the 588th Regiment and confirming that not only were the stories true, they had actually been understated. The German perspective post-war. In 1992, German historian Franz Karofsky conducted interviews with Eastern Front veterans for a book on night bombing operations. When he asked about the night witches, he got reactions he didn't expect. The sound, one veteran told him, "I can still hear it. 50 years later, sometimes at night, I hear wind through trees and I'm back in Russia, waiting for the bombs. My wife says I wake up sometimes saying, 'Die Hexenkommen,' the witches are coming. The sound haunts us." Another veteran, Hans Windisch, who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, was more analytical. They were the most effective psychological weapon the Soviets deployed. Objectively, those little biplanes couldn't do much damage. But subjectively, they destroyed morale. You couldn't see them, couldn't fight them.